Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, there are times when the gospel stories seem so very distant from us, ancient, unfamiliar, archaic. This is not one of those times. This story is all too human, all too current. A fragile, thin-skinned tyrant with an overactive libido and a preference for daughter figures is so afraid of losing face in front of his wife and in front of his base that he compromises what little principles he has and he sacrifices an innocent teller. It's practically ripped from the headlines, as they used to say on Law and Order. But of course, it's more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that. Because this is a story about human nature, and human nature is contradictory and messy. It's why we chose to share our gospel story through this special telling that Croissant read for us this morning. Because we hear about King Herod a lot in the Christmas story, in this one, in Jesus' trial. But do we ever think about who he really was behind the caricature? How we may see a little bit of ourselves in his story. Because chances are, while we don't wield his kind of power, we have all faced moral dilemmas. At some point, we've all been faced with a choice between doing the hard, right thing, the moral and ethical thing, or saving face, or pleasing someone. We may never have condemned someone to death because they were getting all up in our business, but we may have tried to silence someone because they saw through us or called us out on our bad behavior. We may have let our better selves be compromised because it was easier to give in than to stand up. Choosing expedience over justice, popularity ahead of conscience. In fact, I think we do it all the time. And sometimes we may even have convinced ourselves that we don't have a choice. This story reminds us of the cost of that delusion. But it may not be a story that we expect to share in church on a Sunday morning. I mean, we come here to get a little good news, do we not? And I'm hard-pressed to find any in this one. And it makes me wonder a little bit why Mark would even include it, especially with the lurid details that he does. I mean, it's filled with violence and lust and greed and complicated relationships, bad behavior, human frailty, compromised values. But we really shouldn't be shocked. As one New Testament professor used to say at the beginning of her class, bending her softcover Bible, I prefer a Bible that is flexible. The Bible is not a manual for morality, it's a mirror of our identity. Ain't that the truth? And here's another thing that I've learned about the Gospels, about the whole Bible, actually. It's that sometimes you have to look a bit beyond the one passage in question to find the good news. Now, Mark is a writer of very few words, so the simple fact that he even tells this story is important. So let's see where he's taking us. Risking stating the obvious, here is the first thing I hear Mark saying to us. This story is told because it's true and it's real. When you put an insecure person in power, they can do a lot of damage. Most often to the folks who are most vulnerable. And here's the second thing I hear. Preaching the gospel is a risky thing to do. Challenging the powers with God's message of subversive love makes them nervous. It might land us in prison. We might just end up losing our heads. Power does not take kindly to being unmasked. Be prepared for that, Mark is telling us. Yet beyond those two rather obvious truths, is a bigger story, I think. A story about what it means to have power and to make choices. And that is never a simple thing. Real life is filled with hard choices that ask us to take a stand for where our heart and our conscience lie. So does the gospel. So does following Jesus. Pick up your cross and follow me is not a rallying cry for many of us. Neither is love your enemies, give away your possessions, turn the other cheek. The message we as Christians have to share will never make us popular. It will not make us powerful. It will tick off a lot of people. Those who dare to tell it will often end up silenced, and that's the gospel truth, and that isn't really shocking. But here's where I find a glimpse of the good news lurking on the edges of this awful story. There's another truth we can wring out of it. Because as true as it is, this story is not the only story. It's not the whole story. And it's definitely not the end of the story. And Mark knows that. So here's the rest. When tyrants bellow and condemn, there are people who refuse to be silent. When bullies create chaos out of their insecurity, there are people who speak truth to power. When we are tempted to go along with cruelty toward another as the path of least resistance, there are folks who will hold us accountable to our better angels. People who are fearless and righteous and are willing to risk it all to keep telling us the truth. John the Baptist was one such person. So was Jesus. He came to show us that life is more than survival, more than amassing power, more than taking the easy, expedient, compromised path through life. Herod kept saying that he doesn't have a choice. That's a lie. We all do. No matter how powerful or less powerful we are, we can choose justice. We can choose compassion. We can choose humanity. And that is the rest of the story that Jesus silently shares when he stands before Herod on the last night of his life. And that's the rest of the story that is shouted into the heavens when he rises 3 days later. Jesus comes so that there can be a better ending to our stories than we could ever have imagined possible, even when it looks like the powers of expedience will win every time. No matter what is falling apart in our lives, no matter how the world's powers seem to be getting the better of us, God has a different dream, and that dream is the truth of love and justice that cannot be silenced. The good news that we share today in the midst of this awful story of humanity's worst tendencies is that there is a more powerful story to tell, and it can be ours if we choose it to be. May it be so. Amen.